This week's Parsha, Vayikra, begins the third book of the 5 books of the Torah, called Vayikra or Leviticus, written by Moshe Rabbeinu himself. The entire book is taken up with the laws and details of the sacrifices, offerings, and rituals in the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. Among the many offerings are the stars of the show, the animal sacrifices. I know there are many religious Jews, especially vegetarians and vegans, that believe there will be no animal sacrifices in the third and final temple to be built soon in our days, that this was part of the barbaric ancient past that also included slavery as part of everyday life. I have no idea and wouldn't presume to predict God's ways. However, I will say that I don't consider animal sacrifices in the temple to be barbaric, and these sacrifices do not conflict with my modern sensibilities towards the humane and considerate treatment of animals. It just happens that these modern sensibilities towards the humane treatment of animals originally comes from the Bible. So it would be ironic indeed if the same Torah then spent an entire book explaining 100 different ways to torture animals with these sacrifices. But why is it not barbaric? And why does God want us to burn animals or incense to or for him? So, if we conceive of the tabernacle as a dwelling for God's presence on earth, and God is one, meaning that everything physical and material, as well as everything immaterial, like thoughts and emotions, are all part of God, then the tabernacle would be ground zero for all activities related to unification and connection of all things in the universe. And all rituals in the temple or tabernacle would be honoring and sanctifying this oneness of all creation. This was also the reason that hatred and factionalism was such a fatal flaw and the reason for the destruction of the temple. And if we understand all the mitzvot of the Torah to be actions that have the ability, with proper intention, to unify the various worlds, the spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and physical worlds, then this means violating the Torah would lead to a disunification of the various worlds. And by the way, this isn't just the greater godly worlds that giant moral leaders occupy. Each of us is our own world, as the Talmud says, and each of us has the same ability and obligation to unify our own personal worlds. Our primary struggles in life should be within our own worlds, not with the greater world. This is what's meant with the saying, it's more difficult to rule oneself than to rule a city. So when the tabernacle was built and God's presence was resting there in the midst of the camp, the children of Israel were in a constant state of spiritual connectedness and therefore fully conscious of the oneness in everything. And they performed the mitzvot that Moshe told them about with full intentionality to connect their worlds. So when they sinned and disconnected from this constant spiritual tree of life oneness energy, they felt the need to sacrifice something of their physical self and negative emotions, basically their lower self and the source of their sin, to God, the source of the oneness, to be able to reconnect with this oneness. Ideally, it would be their physical beings in some way, because of the disruption they caused in their connection between their upper spiritual and higher self and their lower physical and negative self. However, God is all merciful and severely limited any form of physical punishment in the Torah. And even where justified, the legal hurdles required to implement those punishments were just not practical, and it never happened. So the next best thing would be animals. Obviously only kosher and specific animals, but still the highest life forms under humans. And when the individual, together with his priest, sacrificed his animal offering and performed the associated rituals, he experienced the life force leaving the physical animal and thereby reconnected his own spiritual force with his own physical self. But in what way is this animal sacrifice connecting worlds and honoring God's oneness of all creation? The animal is used in various ways. Some parts and some whole sacrifices are entirely burned to ashes to God. Other parts are eaten by the priest or the individual that brought the sacrifice. Looked at through the prism of all of creation being one, all of these sacrificial activities are just reallocating the parts of this animal being back into another form in the one universe. For example, the burned parts took the flesh and converted it to ash, heat, and smoke. The smoke was particularly appealing to God, as the Torah calls it a pleasing aroma to God. The incense smoke uses the same phrasing. The smoke is appealing to God as the source of higher spirit because it is converting the lower physical matter into a higher form. This burning process is releasing energy back into the universe that was trapped within the physical matter of the animal. This is not a spiritual fact. This is the first law of thermodynamics. But if, as even science understands, that this lower form of energy does not disappear, it just changes form, then we can understand how this process will serve and honor the God of oneness that gives us the opportunity to reconnect our lower selves to our upper spiritual selves by metaphorically giving back to God through converting a lower form of energy into a higher form within the vast and connected one universe. And the rest of the animals also used in many ways, including being eaten. This brings huge benefit to the animal in that parts of its physical self are now in the process of reconstituting themselves into higher human form by virtue of our eating it. And the life force of the animal, as it departs through holy and proper sacrifice with the full conscious intentionality of the priest, reattaches itself to the source of all life, bringing tremendous pleasure to itself and its source. This entire process was done honorably and with dignity and respect for all parties, including the animals. I in no way compare this process, God forbid, to alien forms of animal sacrifice for idol worship, where I'm sure the practices were barbaric in many different ways, including ultimately the purpose of the sacrifice, which was not to create oneness, but the opposite. It was mostly meant to transfer power and placate an angry or otherwise demanding idol. I think this is a good way of conceiving of the Torah's form of animal sacrifice and how it might be understood using the language of today's value systems and perspectives. May God hasten the arrival of Mashiach, who we all wait for more and more every day, especially in these stressful and uncertain times, and who will definitely be able to tell us if there will be animal sacrifices in the new temple. Shabbat Shalom from exile once again, and hopefully for the last time this trip. With God's help, my next communication will be from the Holy Land that I yearn to return home to with all my soul. Shabbat Shalom.